After 50 years of marriage, he finally told me the truth about that night. That single sentence still echoes in my mind, soft as the rain that was falling outside when he said it. But before that truth came, there were decades of silence, decades of pretending that one night had simply never happened. Sometimes the longest relationships hide the deepest untold stories. What happens when the person you've shared your whole life with finally speaks the truth you've waited decades to hear? This isn't just a story about love. It's about forgiveness, silence, and the courage to speak what was once buried. Now, my dear, let's begin. It began in the summer of 1968, the night the storm rolled in from the valley. Henry and I were newly married then, just two young souls trying to build a life on borrowed dreams and a secondhand house. We didn't have much, just a kettle that whistled too loud and a bed that creaked like an old song. But we had each other, or so I thought. That night was supposed to be ordinary. I had cooked stew, he'd come home late from the mill. We ate quietly, the radio humming in the corner. Then a call came, an urgent one, and Henry's face went pale. He said, "It's nothing, Clara. Go to bed." But it wasn't nothing. I remember the headlights cutting through the rain as he drove away. I waited for him until dawn, sitting by the window with a blanket and 100 questions. When he returned, his shirt was damp, his hands shaking slightly. He just said, "Everything's fine," and we never spoke of it again. Not that day, not that year, not ever. Years passed. Life filled the silence with babies' cries, birthdays, laughter, work, and growing old. But every now and then, when storms came, I'd see it. The shadow in his eyes. Something unspoken lived there. I learned to let it be, the way you let a scar rest under your sleeve. We raised Daniel and Ruth. We built a life that looked steady from the outside, and for the most part, it was. But love built on mystery has a hollow sound when you tap it. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wake and find him sitting by the window staring out at the darkness. He'd think I was asleep, but I'd hear him whisper a name I didn't recognize, just once. Then silence again. I never asked. Maybe I was afraid of the answer. Maybe I thought keeping the peace was the same as keeping love. Either way, that night remained between us, like an old letter never opened. Then, on our 50th anniversary, everything changed. We'd planned nothing fancy, just dinner at home, the two of us, and a cake Ruth had baked. The years had softened us both. His hair was white, my hands lined, but there was comfort in our quiet companionship. After dinner, he asked me to sit with him on the porch. The sky was pink with the last light, cicadas buzzing in the trees. He held my hand and said, "Clara, there's something I should have told you a long time ago." My heart stilled. Half a century of waiting suddenly felt like a single breath. But he didn't speak that night. He just looked at me with eyes full of something I couldn't name. Sorrow, maybe, or relief, and said, "Tomorrow. I'll tell you tomorrow." And then he squeezed my hand and smiled the way he used to when we first met, as if he were already half in another world. That was the last night before the truth finally came. The night we never spoke of. The night that became the thread running through 50 years of our life together. Quiet, invisible, but always there. I didn't know it then, but what he was about to tell me would change the way I remembered everything. Our love, our marriage, and even myself. After that night, the night Henry said, "Tomorrow," life carried on as though nothing had changed, but something had. It was as if his words had opened a small window inside my heart, and every day afterward, a little more light and a little more fear slipped through. He never told me what that night was about, not in words, but I began to see pieces of it in everything he did. In the mornings, I'd wake to find him sitting quietly at the table, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands, lost in thought. Some days, he'd ask about the children's birthdays. Other days, he'd ask questions he already knew the answers to. It wasn't confusion, it was avoidance, like a man rehearsing for a truth he couldn't yet speak. He'd say things like, "You've always deserved honesty, Clara." And I'd reply softly, "Then give it to me." But he never did. Instead, he'd kiss my forehead and whisper, "Not yet. Not yet." Those two words became the quiet drumbeat of our life. The years rolled by in seasons. There were picnics, graduations, hospital visits, even grandchildren who called him Grandpa Henry with laughter and sticky fingers. From the outside, we looked like any other couple who had weathered life together. But at night, when the house fell still, I'd sometimes lie awake, wondering, what could one secret possibly hold for 50 years? What kind of truth grows that quietly, like a vine wrapping around everything it touches? One evening, after dinner, I finally asked. He was sitting in his favorite chair, the fire crackling beside him. I said, "Henry, it's been half a century. Whatever happened that night, I can take it. Please, just tell me he didn't look at me right away." Then, very softly, he said, "Do you remember that storm, Clara? The one that came the week after we married?" "Of course," I said, "the night you left." He nodded. "That's the one." Then he went quiet again. So quiet I could hear the fire breathing. When I thought he'd changed his mind, he spoke. Only one sentence. "I thought I could protect you from it," he whispered. But I was wrong. "Oh, protect me from what?" I didn't ask. Not yet. Something in his voice stopped me. It was too heavy, too fragile, as if saying the rest might break something we still had left. So I did what I'd always done. I reached for his hand and said, "When you're ready." He squeezed back and gave me that small, weary smile I'd come to love. The one that said he was trying, even when it hurt. The next morning, he was gone early. A note sat by my coffee mug. "Running an errand, my love. Don't worry. Just a small thing I need to set right." I folded the paper, feeling an ache I couldn't name. After 50 years, you learn to read between the lines. And that morning, I could tell something in him had shifted, as if he'd finally decided to face whatever that night had held. But by afternoon, when the phone rang, my heart knew before my mind did. It was the hospital. Henry had collapsed at the corner store. They said it was sudden, peaceful. His heart had simply stopped, as though it had been carrying too much for too long. I remember sitting in that sterile white hallway, the smell of antiseptic and rain mixing in the air. My hands shook as I waited for the nurse to call my name. When she finally did, she said something that would stay with me forever. "He had something in his pocket," she said. "It's addressed to you." She handed me a small sealed envelope, slightly wrinkled, my name written in his familiar hand. I clutched it to my chest, whispering, "Not yet, Henry. Not yet." Because I wasn't ready. Not to read it. Not to face the truth that had waited half a century to be told. That letter, that folded piece of paper, sat unopened for weeks on my nightstand. I'd pick it up at night, trace the edges, and set it back down again. I didn't need to read it to know it held everything I'd feared and everything I'd loved in one small space. And when I finally did open it, it changed everything I thought I knew about that night. The hospital always smells the same, like bleach and loss and hope, all mixed into one. Even after all these years, I can still remember that scent. It was raining the day Henry left me for the second time, not by choice, but by fate. The rain came down in sheets against the hospital windows, the kind that blurs the world into water and light. I remember thinking how fitting it was. Henry had always loved the rain, said it made everything softer, quieter, like the world was listening. But that day, it was me who was listening to the steady hum of machines, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, and the heavy silence that filled every space between. When I first got the call, I didn't cry. There's a strange kind of calm that comes when your heart already knows what your ears are hearing. I drove there in silence, the letter still unopened in my purse, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered. When I reached his room, the nurse stopped me at the door. "He's resting," she said softly. It was sudden but peaceful. "He's not in pain." I nodded, but my knees trembled. Peaceful. That word always sounds so kind when people use it, but all I could think was, he's gone, and I wasn't there. The room was dimly lit, just a soft glow from the lamp beside his bed. Henry looked smaller somehow, his hands folded neatly on his chest, his face calm. Too calm. His wedding band gleamed faintly under the light. I sat down beside him, holding his still hand between mine. It was cool, not cold yet. And I whispered, "You were supposed to tell me tomorrow, remember?" The words caught in my throat. 50 years of waiting, and now time had decided for us. Thou. Beside the bed sat a small table, his glasses, his wallet, his old watch, and a folded piece of paper tucked neatly under the rim of a glass. My name written on it in his familiar hand. It wasn't the same letter the nurse had given me. This one was different, older, worn, like it had been carried for years. I picked it up carefully, my fingers trembling, and for a moment, I just stared at it, wondering how many times he had meant to give it to me. I unfolded it slowly. The ink was faded in places, the paper soft from being touched too many times. My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, then there's a good chance I never found the courage to say what I should have said long ago. There are truths that grow heavier with silence, and I've carried one for too long. That night, the one we never spoke of, wasn't about another woman. It wasn't betrayal. It was guilt. And not the kind that fades with time. You remember the storm. You remember I left after that phone call. What you don't know is who called me. My breath caught. My eyes darted down the page. It was my brother, Samuel. You never met him. I told you he'd gone away young, that we'd lost touch. But the truth is, he was in trouble. Real trouble. He'd borrowed money he couldn't pay back, from men who didn't ask twice. That night he called me begging for help. Said if I didn't come, he'd disappear for good. So I left. I told myself I'd be back before you even woke. But the storm got worse, and by the time I found him, it was too late. I stopped reading. The room tilted. Too late. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes to keep going. He was gone, Clara. I never told you because I didn't know how. I thought I could protect you from the pain, and from me. But every time it rained, every time I looked at you, I saw his face and remembered that I came home to warmth when he never got the chance. I spent the next 50 years trying to make it right by being the husband, the father, the man I couldn't be that night. But guilt doesn't go away when it's buried under love. It just hides until the day it has to be spoken. The last line trailed off in shaky handwriting. The ink bled slightly, like maybe a tear had fallen there. His, not mine. I pressed the letter against my chest and whispered, "Oh, Henry." It was strange. For so long, I'd imagined that night as something dark, something that stood between us. I thought maybe he'd fallen out of love, that his silence meant shame or distance. But it wasn't that. It was grief. It was a secret soaked in sorrow, carried for decades by a man who never stopped trying to make amends. And in that moment, sitting in the still air of the hospital room, I realized I'd been waiting for a confession, but what I got was a truth wrapped in love. I stayed with him for hours, talking softly even though he couldn't hear me. I told him everything I hadn't said out loud, about the nights I waited, the questions I buried, the love that never left. I thanked him for the years he gave me, and then I made a promise of my own that I would forgive him, not because I had to, but because he'd already punished himself enough. When the nurse came back in, she asked gently, "Would you like a few more minutes?" I nodded, but I wasn't crying anymore. The tears had run out, leaving behind something else, a quiet peace. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "It's all right now, Henry. You can rest. Then I picked up the first letter, the one from his pocket, the one I hadn't dared to open until now. It was shorter, only a few lines. Clara, if tomorrow never comes, I want you to know. You were the best part of my life. I'm sorry for what I carried, but you gave me something that guilt never could take away. Peace. I love you. That word, peace, lingered in the air like a sigh, and I knew he had finally found it. The weeks that followed passed in slow, quiet waves. The funeral was simple, just as Henry would have wanted. A few family members, soft hymns, and the smell of rain in the air. Daniel spoke, voice trembling, about his father's kindness and patience. And when he asked if I wanted to say something, I said, "No, sweetheart." He said it for both of us because Henry's letters, both of them, had already spoken all the words I needed. Afterward, when the guests had gone and the house grew silent again, I sat at the table with a cup of tea, staring at the empty chair across from me. I placed both letters in front of me, side by side, one old, one new. It struck me then, both of us had kept promises. He promised to protect me from pain, and I promised to love him through it. Neither of us broke them. We just misunderstood what they meant. Days turned into weeks, and little by little, the ache in my chest began to soften. Grief is strange that way. It doesn't fade all at once. It loosens its grip one breath at a time. Sometimes I'd walk into our bedroom and half expect to see him sitting by the window again, humming that same quiet tune. But then I'd smile because in some way I did see him, in the morning light, in the sound of the rain, in the steadiness of my own heartbeat. A month later, a small package arrived in the mail. No return address, just my name written in neat, careful letters. Inside was a simple wooden box. Old, but polished smooth. The kind of thing Henry would have made in his workshop. Inside was a folded note and a photograph. The photo was of two young men, Henry and another, almost identical. His brother, Samuel. They were standing by a lake, arms around each other, grinning at the camera. And the note read, "Mrs. Harlan, your husband came to see me a few months ago. I'm Samuel's son. He told me the truth about that night, how he tried to help my father and never forgave himself for being too late. I told him something he needed to hear, that none of it was his fault. My father made his choices. Your husband made peace with that, right before he passed. He said he wanted you to have this photograph, to remind you that forgiveness runs both ways. With love and thanks, Michael." I held that photo for a long time. The two brothers, so young, so alive, and suddenly I could see it all clearly. The night Henry left wasn't the beginning of our distance. It was the start of his lifelong attempt to make peace with the past. He hadn't betrayed me. He'd been trying to save someone, and in doing so, he'd lost a piece of himself he could never reclaim. And yet, for 50 years, he still showed up every day, loving, laughing, building, providing, trying to balance a wound he never shared. That, I realized, was its own kind of heroism. That evening, I took the letters and the photograph and placed them in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, beside the quilt he'd made me years ago. It felt right, like the story had finally found its resting place. As I closed the lid, I whispered, "You can rest now, Henry. You kept your promise, and so did I." But before I went to bed that night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I stepped outside into the rain. The air was cool and clean, the droplets soft against my skin. I tilted my face upward, letting the water wash over me, and for the first time, I didn't think of the storm that took his brother. I thought of the one that brought him back to me, through truth, through time, through love that refused to fade. Because the truth wasn't about that night anymore. It was about every day that followed. The ordinary mornings, the quiet forgiveness, the shared years that had outlived the pain. Later, lying in bed, I realized something simple but profound. We spend so much of our lives waiting for the truth, fearing it, building walls around it. But sometimes the truth doesn't come to break us. It comes to free us. And when it finally does, you see that love was never about perfection. It was about choosing to stay, even when you didn't understand everything. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in years. No waiting, no wondering, no weight left unspoken. Just the steady hum of rain outside my window and the quiet comfort of knowing that even the hardest truths can lead us home. I hadn't planned on writing to Michael, Samuel's son. When his letter arrived with that photograph, I thought that was the end, the final stitch in a wound that had taken 50 years to heal. But as the days passed, I found myself thinking about him more and more. I wondered what Henry had said when he met him, what kind of man he'd been that day, quiet and gentle as he always was, or heavy with the weight of what he'd carried for so long. Sometimes I'd find myself sitting by the window with my tea, looking at the picture of the two brothers. They looked so happy, carefree, sunburned, arms around each other like nothing in the world could come between them. And then I'd think about how life has a way of changing in a single night, and how love, in all its forms, leaves behind echoes that travel farther than we ever expect. So one evening, I did something simple. I took out my stationery and wrote a letter. Dear Michael, thank you for your kindness and for sending me the photograph. It brought me more peace than you can imagine. If you ever pass through Maplewood, please stop by. I'd love to hear what my husband told you. Sometimes it helps to hear the truth in another person's voice. With warmth, Clara Harlan. I sealed the letter before I could change my mind. It wasn't about reopening the past anymore. It was about honoring it, understanding it from someone who had been part of the same story, even if only at the very end. A week later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, a man stood there, tall, kind-faced, his hair touched with silver. He looked like Henry in a way, not in the details, but in the feeling he gave. Calm, steady, familiar. Mrs. Harlan? He asked gently. Yes, I said, already knowing. You must be Michael. He smiled. I was driving through town and thought I'd take you up on that invitation. I stepped aside. Please, come in. I just put a pot of tea on, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same one Henry had built years ago. It felt strange and comforting all at once, like the past had walked in, taken off its coat, and decided to stay for a while. Michael looked around, his gaze landing on the framed photo of Henry on the mantel. He told me about this house, he said softly. Said it was his greatest pride, not the house itself, but the life inside it. I smiled. He loved this place. Every nail in it had a story. Michael nodded. He said you were the reason he learned how to build anything at all, that you taught him patience. I let out a quiet laugh. Patience and Henry were rarely in the same room together, but I suppose we learned it from each other. After a pause, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. I thought you should have this, he said. It's something your husband left behind when he came to see me. My heart gave a little jolt. Another letter? He shook his head. Not a letter this time. Something else. I opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of newspaper, yellowed and creased. When I unfolded it, I realized it was an obituary. Samuel Harlan, 1941 to 1968. Below it was a photograph, the same one from the box, but smaller, grainier. There was also a handwritten note in the margin in Henry's old script. He wasn't lost forever, Clara. I found him again through his son. I looked up, my throat tight. He carried this all those years? Michael nodded. He kept it in his wallet. Every day. He told me once that he didn't know if he'd ever be able to forgive himself for not getting there in time. But when we met, he said he finally could. I took a shaky breath. What did he say to you exactly? Michael leaned back, thoughtful. He came to see me one rainy afternoon, a few months before he passed. Said he'd been looking for me for years, but never found the courage to knock. He paused. He told me what happened that night. how he drove through the storm, how he found my father too late, and then he said something I'll never forget. What was it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He said, I spent 50 years trying to save a life I already lost, but I forgot. I still had one to live and a woman who never stopped waiting for me to come home. My breath caught. Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. Michael continued softly. He asked if I could forgive him, not for what he did, but for what he couldn't do. And I told him I could, because that kind of love doesn't need fixing. It just needs to be remembered. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The rain had started again, tapping gently on the windows, and I couldn't help but feel like Henry was somewhere in it. Between every drop, every sigh of wind, every heartbeat still echoing through this house. Finally, I said, I think he always hoped you'd find peace too. Michael smiled faintly. I did. And I think he did too, finally. He told me something else before he left. What was that? He hesitated, then looked straight at me. He said he'd written one last thing, not for you to read, but for you to feel. He said, she'll know what it means when she finds it. I frowned softly. What could that mean? I'm not sure, he said, but he was sure you'd understand. After he left, I sat at the table long after the tea had gone cold. I looked around the room, the clock ticking softly, the sound of the rain outside, and tried to imagine what Henry could have meant. I'd gone through his things already. The letters, the notes, the old photographs. What was left to find? Then, as I turned toward the fireplace, I noticed something I hadn't before. A small wooden box on the bottom shelf, tucked behind a stack of books. It was covered in dust, the hinges slightly rusted. I pulled it out slowly and carried it to the table. Inside were bits and pieces from our life together. Ticket stubs, pressed flowers, small tools he'd used for woodwork, and one more folded sheet of paper. But this one wasn't written like a letter. It looked like notes, short lines, almost like thoughts left behind. She never stopped believing in me. Every time it rained, I thought of her waiting by the window. If I go first, I hope she knows. She was never the reason I left. She was the reason I came home. I felt something inside me break open, not in pain, but in release. He hadn't written those words for me to read. He'd written them to remind himself what love really was. And somehow, even after he was gone, they had found their way back to me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the rain again, holding that note in my hands. And for the first time, I realized something I'd never understood before. Henry hadn't kept the truth from me because he didn't trust me. He'd kept it because he loved me too much to let his guilt spill into our home. All those years, I thought he was protecting himself, but really, he was protecting us. The next morning, I called Michael. He answered quickly, his voice kind and steady. Michael, I said, thank you for coming yesterday. There's something I want you to know. What's that? I forgive him, I said simply. Not because he asked me to, but because love deserves peace. And I think your father would want you to know Henry never stopped trying to make it right. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, you sound like him, you know. The way you talk about forgiveness, I smiled through tears. That's because we spent 50 years teaching each other how. After we hung up, I took the small wooden box to the porch. The rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds, painting everything in gold. I opened the box and let the sunlight fall over the words he'd written. Then I whispered, you were right, Henry. I do know what it means because I finally understood his message. The truth wasn't about that night anymore. It was about what came after, about how two people can spend a lifetime walking through the same storm and still end up in the light together. The day I began that evening, Daniel and Emily stopped by. They brought dinner and laughter, the kind that fills every empty corner of a house. As we sat around the table, Daniel said, Mom, you've been quieter lately. You okay? I smiled. I'm better than I've been in years. He tilted his head. What changed? I looked at the photo of Henry and Samuel on the shelf, the two young men who started it all, and I said softly, I finally heard his side of the story. Emily reached over and took my hand. You must miss him. I do, I said. But missing someone isn't the same as losing them. He's still here, in everything we built together. After they left, I stood on the porch watching the sun set behind the hills. The world was quiet, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and blooming jasmine. And I thought about how love changes form but never disappears. Sometimes it's a letter in a drawer, a photo in a box, or a memory that visits in the rain. And sometimes it's just the soft knowledge that you were loved, even in silence, even in secrets. That was Henry's confession. Not words of guilt, but words of love, spoken in the only way he knew how. There are moments in life that never quite fade. They only soften around the edges, like an old photograph that's been held too many times. For me, that moment was that night. The night Henry left in the storm and everything changed. For 50 years, it lingered in the back of my mind, the question I never had the courage to ask. Now, I finally knew the answer. And yet, it wasn't the end of the story, because the truth, the real truth, has a way of unfolding slowly, like dawn breaking after a long, sleepless night. A week after Michael's visit, I found myself walking through the attic. It's strange how grief sends you searching, not for pain, but for presence. You want to touch what they touched, hold what they built, feel the shape of their life still lingering in the quiet places. The attic smelled of cedar and dust, sunlight slanting through the old window, boxes stacked neatly, just as Henry left them. He was meticulous like that. Every nail, every photograph, every memory in its proper place. As I looked around, one box caught my eye, marked only with the word home. It was heavier than the rest. I pulled it down carefully and sat cross-legged on the floor. Inside were old tools, a few wood carvings, and at the very bottom, a small notebook bound in leather. Its pages were brittle with time, the handwriting uneven. I opened it slowly, and there it was, the last piece of the puzzle. On November 12th, 1968. It's raining again. The roads are flooding. I can't shake the sound of Samuel's voice, the way it cracked when he said, "Please, if anything happens tonight, I want Clara to know I tried. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't go." The next page was smeared with ink, as though water or tears had fallen on it. The bridge collapsed. I barely made it across. I found him. Too late. He was gone when I got there. His eyes were open. I closed them myself. I don't know how to tell her. How do you go home to the woman you love and tell her you couldn't save your own brother? I'll tell her tomorrow. I just need one night to forget the look on his face. I turned the page, heart pounding. November 13th. I told her nothing. I lied, and I hate myself for it. But when I saw her smile that morning, the way she poured my coffee, humming like the world hadn't ended, I couldn't do it. I couldn't break her heart with my guilt. So I built us a life instead. Maybe that will be enough. And then, at the very end, written in trembling script years later, if she ever finds this, I hope she knows. I didn't hide the truth to spare myself. I hid it to keep our love untouched. Because sometimes the past doesn't need to be fixed. It just needs to rest. I sat there for a long time, the notebook open in my lap. The attic was quiet except for the rain beginning again outside, tapping softly on the roof, the same rhythm that had carried us through so many years. I finally understood it all. That night wasn't a betrayal or a secret built on lies. It was the beginning of a promise that he kept in every nail he hammered, every meal we shared, every sunrise we watched side by side. Later that afternoon, I walked to the lake behind our house, the same lake where the two brothers had posed for that photograph so long ago. The air was cool and still, the water rippling gently under the gray sky. I carried the notebook with me and the photograph. I sat down on the old wooden bench Henry had built the summer before his heart attack, and for a while, I just talked to him. "Do you remember this place?" I whispered. "You brought me here on our third date. Said the lake made you feel small in a good way, reminded you that life keeps going, even when it hurts." The wind rustled the trees, as if answering. "I used to think you left me that night," I said softly. "But you didn't. You went to help someone who needed you. You just never made it back in time. And I carried the wrong pain for 50 years. I took a deep breath. "But I forgive you, Henry. I forgive the silence, the nights you couldn't sleep, the look in your eyes when it rained, because now I understand. You didn't fail him. You loved him, and you loved me even more for the rest of your life." I stood up, holding the photograph in one hand, the notebook in the other. Then, gently, I tore out the last page, the one that said, "Sometimes the past doesn't need to be fixed. It just needs to rest." I folded it carefully, pressed it against my heart, and whispered, "Rest now, Henry. We both can." Then I placed it under a flat stone by the water's edge, a quiet grave for the truth that had haunted us both. As I walked home, I didn't feel heavy anymore. I felt light, lighter than I had in years. That night, Daniel called. "Mom," he said, "Emily and I were talking about coming by this weekend. We want to help you sort through Dad's things." I smiled into the phone. "I've already done that, sweetheart. But you can still come. Maybe we'll bake his favorite pie." He laughed. "You never change." "Some things shouldn't," I said. After we hung up, I sat by the fireplace with a cup of chamomile tea. The rain had stopped, and the air outside was glowing with the afterlight of a storm, that clean, golden quiet that comes when the world exhales. I thought about Henry, about Samuel, about the years between, about how love can carry both joy and sorrow and still survive. And I realized something I wish I'd understood sooner. The truth doesn't always come to destroy the past. Sometimes it arrives to remind us how strong we were to have lived through it. A few days later, I received another letter, from Michael again. "Dear Mrs. Harlan, I wanted you to know I visited my father's grave yesterday. I took the photograph of him and your husband. I placed it between their names and told them they were finally side by side again. Thank you for giving my family peace. With love, Michael." I pressed the letter to my heart, tears warm against my cheeks. It felt like the world had come full circle. One story, two families, 50 years of silence, and at last, forgiveness. That evening, I went back to the lake. The sunset painted the sky in pinks and golds, the kind of beauty that hurts a little because it's fleeting. I sat down, letting the cool air brush against my face, and as I watched the water shimmer, I said softly, "After 50 years of marriage, he finally told me the truth about that night." And it wasn't a confession of guilt, it was a declaration of love. Maybe that's what life really is, a collection of truths we're too scared to say until we have no choice. But when we do, when we finally let them out, the world doesn't fall apart. It just grows quieter, kinder, like the calm after rain. And in that quiet, you find something stronger than forgiveness. You find understanding. When I got home, I took one last look at the notebook before placing it back in the cedar chest. Then I whispered, "Good night, Henry." I turned off the light, the room bathed in moonlight, and I could almost feel him there, not as a ghost, but as a memory that had finally found peace. For the first time in 50 years, I didn't dream of that storm. I dreamed of the lake, still endless and bathed in morning light. Every story leaves a little warmth behind, doesn't it? If this one touched your heart, don't wander too far. There are more stories waiting here at Grandma's Story Lounge. Stories of love, hope, and second chances. So, my dear, click that subscribe button and stay a while, because the next story might just be the one you need to hear.